Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video we will be taking a look at the phrase might makes right. Is it true? Does might make right? Well, let's think about that. And my reason to think about that is that suddenly I see this phrase popping up again and again in analyses of the new policies of the second Trump administration in the United States of America. So the idea of these analysts is that there's something new, maybe even radically new, about the way that Donald Trump approaches the international order, and that a key to his thinking or the thinking of his administration is precisely that might makes right. And this is then often coupled to certain ideas in political philosophy called realism or neo-realism, which is a particular way of thinking about the character, the nature of international relations. Now, I will not be saying that much about the Trump administration itself, whether it has a coherent system of thought, who is who in that administration and what individuals think. I am going to be focusing on this very idea that might makes right. And I think it's very important for us to analyze that statement. In part because the power of the statement might makes right, its power and its persuasiveness depend upon it not being thought about very well. It can look like a very important statement, a statement with a lot of consequences, but when you start really thinking about it, almost all of that falls apart. So our job as philosophers is to think, and sometimes to think until things start falling apart. So let's do that now. Might makes right. The first thing I want to do is I want to signal two ambiguities. The first ambiguity is that some people, when they use this phrase, might use it in a completely straightforward way. Right? They want to claim that might makes right. That might indeed generate the right. That somehow what is right depends on might. That's one way to hear it. Another way to hear it is maybe more cynically. People can use it and do use it, and maybe even use it at the exact same moment to signal that there is something wrong with the very idea of the right. Maybe what is right is irrelevant. Maybe there is no such thing as right. All there is might. Right? So this is an ambiguity. Might makes right can be a claim about what is right, but it could also be a claim that the right doesn't matter or there is no such thing as the right. We only have to focus on might. Okay, that's the first ambiguity. The second ambiguity is that the phrase might makes right can be understood either descriptively or normatively. Descriptively, it would be just a description of some fact in the world. Right? We look at reality and we find there that might makes right. Right? It's just a statement that could be true or false that we can check, maybe even empirically. It's a description and that's why you have to believe it. Right? If it's a true description, you have to believe it. On the other hand, we can hear the phrase as normative, as telling us what to do. Maybe as telling us not to bother about the right so much and embrace the might. But a normative statement is very different from a descriptive statement. Right? A normative statement tells us what to do. A descriptive statement tells us what is the case. And I think that a lot of the power of the phrase might makes right stems from the fact that these two interpretations, the descriptive and the normative, are not separated. Right? We sort of think of it as describing a fact in the world that we can't deny, and then we feel obligated to also take up a certain normative position about what we ought to do. But these two things have to be separated. It's one thing to describe what's going on, and it is a different thing to take a stance on what we ought to do. And so when we analyze might makes right, and when we wonder whether that's a phrase that we should embrace or reject, we have to keep apart the question, is it descriptively true? Is it normatively true? Right? Does it describe what is the case in the world? Does it tell us how to act? And so what I want to do is I want to look at the phrase first in a sort of descriptive way. Like, what does it describe? What does it claim? And is that claim true? And then I want to think about it as a normative claim, as telling us what to do. And at certain points, I will emphasize the fact that the descriptive claim and the normative claim are really different. Okay, so let's think about it as a descriptive claim. What does it mean to claim that might makes right? Well, it can mean several very different things. So one thing it can mean is this. It can mean that the institutions that are there to protect the right, so let's say morality or justice or the law, need might to back them up. Otherwise, they're not effective. Right? So when I say might makes right, I could mean, well, it's nice to have laws. But if you really want to be effective with laws, you also need the police who can actually capture people and protect the citizens and so on. Right? So it's good to have laws maybe, it's good to have norms, it's good to have morality, but you also need some kind of force or power to back that up. That could be a claim, right? It's a claim about how the world works, norms aren't followed automatically, you need some kind of force or power to back it up. That is not controversial, right? I think almost everybody believes that. Maybe there are a few anarchists somewhere who don't believe it, but almost everyone believes this in one way or another. And this is not the intended meaning of the phrase, might makes right. Right? If people say that, for instance, the Trump administration believes that might makes right, they don't mean that the Trump administration believes that we need the police to back up our laws, or we need the International Criminal Court to back up international laws. Right? They don't mean that. That's not what the phrase is supposed to mean. Okay. The phrase is supposed to mean something more radical. So what could it mean? Well, here's a second interpretation of might makes right. And this is an interpretation that sort of claims that there isn't a lot of right going around. On the second interpretation, might makes right means that we are living in what philosophers might call a Hobbesian state of nature. So the philosopher Thomas Hobbes comes up with this idea of a state of nature where everybody is just doing like whatever they want, including stealing, killing, and there's no power to stop them from doing anything. And so it could be an empirical claim about our society that it is in fact a place where there are no rights, there's just might, it's a Hobbesian state of nature, and nobody is protecting us. You've got to sort of shoot your killer before your killer shoots you. That's what life is like. Well, as an empirical claim about life in our societies, that seems to be just plain wrong. Right? We do have the state, we do have the police, we do have the law courts, and so on and so forth. So we are not living in a state of nature. And Hobbes doesn't believe that we are now living in a state of nature. But, and this is where this sort of neo-realist political philosophy comes in, some people might say, well, we don't live in a state of nature, but states live in a state of nature. Like the nation states, the United States of America, Canada, France, the Netherlands, Brazil, Nigeria, they live in a state of nature. Right? They all do whatever the hell they want, and there's nobody, no international police force or international government to stop them. Okay, well, as an empirical claim, it's more plausible than the claim that in our society we live in a state of nature. But it's not entirely plausible. I mean, we do have certain international institutions to make life among states less like a state of nature. And in certain parts of the world, this seems to be working better than in other parts of the world, or it seems to be stronger than in other parts of the world. So, for instance, the European Union seems to ensure that European states don't live in a state of nature with each other, at least. Maybe they live more in something like a state of nature with countries outside of the Union. All right, even there we have certain bodies, certain laws, certain courts, and so on and so forth. What one could claim empirically is that none of that is very strong, right? That nation states live much more in something like a state of nature than people within a nation state. That's a claim with some empirical plausibility. It's also a claim that absolutely doesn't tell us what to do, right? Because one of the things that we could conclude is that, well, what we need to do is we need to strengthen the international order, right? We need to get more power to back up the international courts. We need to invest in something like a world government. We need to reform the United Nations so that it's more like a government that can create binding laws on nations, and so on and so forth. Or, of course, we could move in the other direction and say, no, nations should have complete self-determination, and so on and so forth. But like the empirical analysis of what the current international situation is just doesn't tell us in which direction to move, right? It tells us something about how strong the international order is, but it doesn't tell us whether we should try to weaken it or strengthen it or keep it the way it is. So descriptively, there might be some reason to say might makes right in the international arena, but normatively, it tells us nothing, right? And you can't base policy on it because it doesn't tell you what to do. All right, so that's a second way to understand might makes right. Now, a third way to understand might makes right as a kind of descriptive statement is that it is telling us what the nature of power is, maybe. Right, so here's one thing you could say. You could say, well, everything that happens because of might. Everything that happens because of power. Why? Well, because power is just that which makes things happen. Right? Might is just what makes things happen. Power is what makes things happen. So whatever happens because of power. You could say that. It makes power kind of analytically or necessarily the same thing as that which makes things happen. And you really have to wonder what the point is of defining power that way, or defining things that happen that way. Right? If we say that everything that happens because of power, then in a state where there is perfect morality and perfect law, well, everything is still happening because of power, right? That's usually not what people mean when they say might makes right. They're not claiming that, like it's some kind of analytic truth in philosophy, that power is just what makes things happen. But we can push this thought maybe a little further into more interesting philosophical territory. We could say something like, well, maybe the nature of things is power. Right? The nature of people is power, the nature of the state is power, the nature of anything is power. And in order to give that some content, we are going to have to say something about what that power consists in or what it strives for. And here one idea we could latch on to, if we know a little bit about the history of philosophy, is we could latch on to the idea we find in Spinoza of conatus. And the idea of conatus is basically that every being strives to keep itself alive, basically, to keep itself coherent in existence and so on. And so if we apply that to the state, we might have to claim that, well, the state is a center of power, and as a center of power, its raison d'être, its reason for existence, and all its striving is going to be towards its own continued self-existence, its own continued existence, right? That's what the state is trying to do. It's trying to make itself continue into the future. Well, that could be a descriptive claim, right? If we look at states, if we look at people, if we look at anything, what we're going to see is it always strives towards future continuation. We could say that. I suppose we could also try to analyze power in a slightly different way, and I'm not even sure that Spinoza would completely disagree with this. Let's take somebody like Nietzsche, right? What does Friedrich Nietzsche tell us? He also tells us, he loves Spinoza actually. He tells us that everything is a center of power, but he's not going to claim that what we strive for as a center of power is mere continued existence. Like for him, power is really sort of to be understood as self-overcoming. Right? I mean, you try to continue to exist, but you're trying to change yourself too, right? Into something better, into a better version of yourself. And again, I'm not sure that Spinoza would disagree with that, right? His own analysis of the good life, where we are continually striving to improve ourselves, actually fits that story very well. Well, but if you have that, if power is self-overcoming, to use Nietzsche's term, all the options are open to you, right? Maybe the state is a center of power, and maybe as a center of power it's trying to overcome itself, and maybe the way it's trying to overcome itself is that it's trying to abolish itself, right? Maybe it's trying to generate a situation where the state doesn't even need to exist anymore because of a global brotherhood of mankind, or because of some completely different state of affairs. Who knows? The philosophical options are wide open. So again, I think we see the same thing. Even if we analyze might makes right as a kind of deep philosophical claim about the fact that everything is power, everything is might, that still leaves open what it means for the world, what it means for the state, and it's not at any point going to tell us sort of straightforwardly what to do. We can still move in many different directions, even if we embrace the idea that the world somehow is power or the state somehow is power. So, a descriptive analysis of the phrase might makes right is never, I submit to you, is never going to tell us what to do. Right? It's not normative. It's not going to directly inform any kind of policy making. We need norms for that. We need an idea of what we want to do, what we ought to do. Okay, so let's think about might makes right, not as a descriptive claim, but as a normative claim. Right? Somebody tells you might makes right, and that means that they want you to accept a certain way of behaving as the right way of behaving. Well, what is that way of behaving? I suppose what might makes right is supposed to mean normatively is that somehow it is good for the powerful to just do what they want. Right? It's good for the powerful to just do what they want. Well, what do we mean with good here? Are we thinking about moral goodness? It is morally good for the powerful to just do what they want. That's basically the idea that Thrasymachus defends in Plato's Republic, and it takes Socrates only a few pages to completely demolish that idea. I mean, whatever we mean by the morally good or the just or something like that, it's not this, right? It's not that the powerful do whatever they want. That's not the nature of morality. So when somebody claims that it's good for the powerful to just do whatever they want, I don't think they're sort of trying to defend a new kind of morality, and if they do, well, they'll have to say more about it. And it seems more like an invitation to just not bother with morality anymore. Right? So the idea would be, if you're into this sort of might makes right doctrine in international relations, that states shouldn't bother about what is right or what is good. They should just do whatever they want, whatever they believe is in their self-interest. So, might makes right becomes an invitation to drop morality and become a thug. But why? Like, why would we want to become a thug? Wait, nobody is seemingly going to force us to become a thug. I suppose you can be forced to become a thug, right? People can put you into a situation, like powerful people can put you into a situation where the only way for you to survive is maybe to engage in some kind of thuggery. That's the Robin Hood scenario, right? I mean, you're kicked out of your village and the powers that be are after you, and the only way to survive is to lead a life of thuggery, I guess. But that's not the story that we're being told in the might makes right doctrine, right? We're not being told the story that if you're really weak, you have to resort to thuggery. No, the story is that if you're really strong, be a thug, man. If you're strong, be a thug. Well, why is that? If you're strong, you don't have to be a thug. Right? If you're strong, you can afford embracing morality. Nobody's going to stop you making the right decisions. Nobody's going to stop you acting in an honorable way, in a good way, in a kind way, in a compassionate way. The stronger you are, the more you can actually try to realize your moral ideals. So what is the idea of might makes right? Right? Why would strength be an invitation to thuggery? Why, if we ourselves are the strong, would we embrace that? Well, I think the only way to make this sort of coherent is not really a way to make it coherent. The only way to make this psychologically appealing, that's what I should say, the only way to make this psychologically appealing is to defend a sort of strange mixture of the claim, well, I'm strong and I'm weak, and that's why I ought to be a thug. Right? I'm weak. I really need to watch out for myself. Everybody's trying to take advantage of me. They're destroying us. We are in danger. Ha! but I'm strong and so I can do whatever I want. So that's why I'm gonna drop morality and just look out for my own interests. That's the story. And I think that if we listen to the kind of political discourse that indeed surrounds, for instance, the Trump administration, but not only the Trump administration, this weird mix of weakness and strength, and maybe we can call it a sort of politics of resentment, that's definitely there, right? There's definitely a sort of talk that on the one hand, oh, we are weak, we are in danger, there are all these other powers out to get us, and they've been really successful at it, and we're on a downward trajectory, and we're gonna fail, and they're taking advantage of us, and oh no, we're in a crisis situation, and yeah, but of course, I mean, we are really strong, we can do whatever we want, we don't need cooperation, we certainly don't need to help other people, it's us. It's not a coherent picture. I don't think it's a coherent picture. I mean, how can you be both weak and strong? How can you be both forced into thuggery because you have to look out for yourself and so strong that you can do whatever you want? I don't think it's coherent, but I believe that that is the psychological story. Philosophically speaking, there doesn't seem to be anything in the claim that might makes right. Right? We've seen that as a descriptive claim, it, you know, maybe it's under some interpretations it can be defended, but then it doesn't have a lot of normative implications. As a normative claim, the normative claim that the strong just should do whatever they want, not think about others, drop morality, only look out for their self-interest, there first of all doesn't seem to be an argument for it. And like the psychological persuasiveness seems to be based on an internally incoherent analysis of one's own position. That's the most I can make of it. So in the end, as far as I can see, when people tell you that might makes right, what they're doing is basically they are inviting you to drop morality and instead start worshipping power. Right? It's an invitation to start worshipping power. To look at the stuff that exists and seems to have power now, and to say, oh yeah, that's what I want to continue, that's what I need to continue, that's what I'm going to bow down to because it's powerful and therefore it will continue. And forget to ask the question, but where is it that we want to go? Right? Forget that there are possibilities and opportunities to actually change the world. Might makes right is a slogan that wants you to embrace being and forget about becoming. That wants you to embrace the stasis of death almost, or at least of a sort of unlife where everything remains the same, and forget about the dynamism of birth and the new. Now, I haven't said anything in this video to convince you that you should believe that we can make things, that we can change the world, that there are all kinds of possibilities, and that dynamism is better than stasis. I haven't said anything about that. But I do think that this slogan, might makes right, which tries to convince you of the opposite, we haven't seen any reason to embrace that either. So, that means that you have a choice. It's the choice between being a thug and living in a world of thugs, or deciding not to be a thug and striving for a world where thuggery isn't the rule. It's up to you.